CSC Fort Ord Reserve and learning about tracking and just a wealth of knowledge. Spends a lot of time out at Fort Ord National Monument, I believe. And yeah, really excited to learn more about wildlife tracking as another avenue to exploring the world around us and the wildlife. But we also appreciate the birds, obviously, are included in that. Here we go. Welcome, Bart.
Thank you. Thank you, Amanda, for that introduction. Thank you for having me. And I guess the first slide doesn't like to load. OK. And thank you all for coming. All right. So like Amanda said, I'm a wildlife tracker. I first learned about tracking when I was still in college. And it's not something that I immediately latched onto, but that curiosity has grown over time. And do we know what's happening here? No.
Is this Carmela?
So let me just figure out what's happening. Let me reload this up again. All right. Hopefully this will work. So yes, I got interested in tracking back in college, and over time that grew into a passion to the point where for the last roughly 10 years I've been one of the co-leaders of the Bay Area Tracking Club that meets monthly, and recently I've been sharing my passion on my blog, Track and Seek. And I figure I'd get started with a story from the Tracking Club that happened last month. This is Gazos Creek State Beach, and it's just north of Año Nuevo, which you can see in the horizon there. And it was a gorgeous Sunday morning. As we gathered in the parking lot, we observed all the wonderful bird life that was present there. Anytime you have freshwater confluence with seawater, that's often a place of rich biodiversity, and that day was especially magnificent for all the bird life that was out there. We also been coming to this place for many, many years. I first visited it probably over 20 years ago, so we're quite well familiar with that place and who may be on there as far as animal life. And
what was it again, the name of the beach?
Gazos Creek State Beach. Yeah. So as we ventured on to the beach and later the dunes, we know that there's all these plants. These are sea rockets, which are actually a non-native European plant. But our local fauna, especially our deer mice, really took a liking to it. All these little indentations around here are tracks of deer mice, and they like these plants for two reasons. One, they provide the refugia, but more importantly, the flowers eventually turn into these nice succulent seed pods that have nice juicy seeds inside, and so they love collecting these seed pods, and oftentimes they'll just consume them right there underneath the plant if they feel safe. If not, they'll clip off a branch with several seed pods and drag it away. And so that's a pattern that we've observed over many, many years. It just happens every time these plants bloom and create the seed pods. But further down, we also found these beautiful tracks. And I'll tell you that these are bobcat tracks, and I'll tell you why, what makes them bobcat tracks a little bit later. But we saw this pattern of two tracks on one side, two tracks on one side, two tracks on one side, continuing on for quite a while across the dunes. And this is a type of gait that's called an overstep walk. That essentially means that the animal is putting its hind foot in front of where the front foot landed, and that indicates a certain type of gait. This animal was moving purposely. It wasn't necessarily dilly-dallying. It wasn't running, but it had certain determination about its walk. And so this pattern was repeating itself for a while until we found a break in the pattern, and we saw this pattern right here with a lot of energy, with kickback of sand and some pushback, and then there was a big gap, and that's where the animal landed. And so now we were really curious, what happened? What caused this animal to change its gait and exert all this energy? In general, animals in the wild don't like to spend extra energy for nothing because it's, well, it's costly for them. And so what do you think happened? So this little mouse that was feeding on the sea rocket became food for the bobcat. And all we found is this nice, clean, almost surgically removed clump of entrails that was left of the mouse. So the injury got transferred from the plant onto the mouse, now into the bobcat. So that was cool. We got to figure out this part of animal story of just what happened. But then we were curious, how did this bobcat know that the mouse was going to be there? We kind of backtracked it and we got down low to the ground to kind of see from the perspective of the animal. And we looked and we realized that the mouse would have been, the bobcat would have been able to see the mouse because there's a dune right in the way. So now it really got us curious. Well, how did it know that this mouse was feeding over in a sea rocket plant? We stipulated, was it able to hear a mouse scurrying across the sand over the sound of crashing waves? That seemed improbable. Was it able to smell it with the predominant wind coming from the northwest? It just left a lot more questions than what we started with. And that's essentially what tracking is. It's recognizing patterns and piecing them together and then telling a story. And so to recap what happened during that part, I mean, we saw a lot of other tracks as well. And so that's not just the only thing that we observed, but this was the highlight for me. We first started scanning the landscape and looking where there may be potential refugia or places where animals may like to feed. We then identify consistent shapes. So this was identifying the bobcat tracks on the sand dunes and also identifying those deer mice tracks. We then notice patterns in movement and how they relate to the surrounding landscape. So we noticed that gait pattern and then that it changed. We recognize behavior patterns and feeding patterns. So we noticed how these mice were running back and forth between all these clumps of sea rockets. And then if you start coming to, or if you've been coming to a place for a long time, you are able to start noticing patterns that change with seasons. For example, that lagoon that I showed you a picture at the beginning, that changes shape pretty much from month to month to month to month. And then what are the animal's habits and what are its relationships? So we've been coming to this beach for a while, like I said, and we've never seen the bobcat tracks out on the open beach. They are always on the sand dunes, whereas if we see coyote tracks, they could be anywhere. They're running up and down the beach, up in the sand dunes, where they feel like. And then we can also notice anomalies in the environment if you know the place very well. So for example, we were really excited to see the bobcat and the coyotes that day because prior to 2019, 2020, we used to see those animals on a regular basis out on this beach. And then after COVID, with all the people coming to the beach, there was a spike in use of people just going outside because they couldn't do anything else. We stopped seeing them. We stopped seeing the coyotes. We stopped seeing the bobcats. And this is several years after that we're starting now to see those patterns emerge that we've noted before. So that's another thing that you can start paying attention to. And then you combine all those elements into a story, and that makes you a tracker. So why are these skills important? For several reasons. So like I tried to show, the skills help me develop a stronger connection to nature and surroundings of the ecosystem. I think I could have gone to that beach without knowing any of this stuff and still have a great experience and a nice day. But having been able to get a window into this animal's life, what the animal was moving, it really enriched my experience, personal experience, my understanding of what this animal is doing. And so it really gets a deeper understanding of the surrounding landscape. There are many practical uses for both researchers and outdoor enthusiasts. I consider myself both. The picture on the right is a picture of a hind foot of a mountain lion on top of a front foot of a mountain lion on top of my foot. And I took this picture probably about 30 minutes after I made this track. I usually don't backtrack on the same way when I walk out and outdoors for that very reasons. But tracking definitely gives you a better awareness of your surroundings and potentially alerts you of any potential dangers. And then there are a lot of uses in conservation with tracking. For example, detecting a rare species in a place where it hasn't been known to occur before, or vice versa. If there are invasive species that you're trying to eradicate, knowing how to recognize their signs or tracks is important. For example, wild pigs in our area, or let's say you are monitoring for snowy plovers and there's nestlings, and the next day you find that they've been predated upon, you may be able to detect what kind of predator was present by looking at its tracks. Last November, there was a really awesome article in the Smithsonian Magazine that essentially talked about utilizing wildlife tracking skills in conservation and had many interesting stories in it. One that stuck to my mind is a story of a woman who was putting out GPS collars on black rhinos in Africa, and there are indigenous trackers who are just kind of laughing at her, like, why do you need all this fancy equipment? Which, by the way, it's a stressful process to put these things on an animal, because you have to put them down, and it causes a lot of stress. But anyway, they're kind of laughing at her, like, why are you going through this when you can just look on the ground and understand what's happening? And their skills are amazing. They're able to tell apart individuals by just looking at different tracks. So I highly recommend this article. Closer to home, this is a screenshot from the Santa Cruz Puma project that's based in Chris Wilmer's lab in UCSC. Every picture of the mountain lion represents an animal that was caught and collared and then fitted with GPS collar, and then they were able to track it with a GPS. But in order to put the collar on the mountain lion, you first have to catch it. And in order to catch it, you first must find it. In order to find it, you have to know where to look and how to track him. I was actually one of the first volunteers for the project, and that involved getting up early before sunrise so that you are driving these dirt roads in Santa Cruz Mountains at daybreak and just trying to find fresh mountain lion tracks. And now, once you find them, they set the hound dog dogs on it so they can follow the animal. They tree it, and that's when the researchers can put it down, and the animal climbs down the tree, and then they can process it and fit it with a radio collar. But that's not the end of it, because every time the GPS signal shows that the animal is not moving, it can indicate one of two things. Either the animal died, or it had killed something and was hanging around its kill site. And that information, you have to, again, go back and track the animal and find out what it was eating. So there was a lot of that happening with the Santa Cruz Puma project. Closer to home, this is a scent station, which essentially is just a circle of fine sifted sand that I baited with this really nasty stuff called gustos, and it smelled terribly, but all the animals, except for bobcats, seemed to really like it. And I set about 70 of those across Fort Ord National Monument. And every of these stations, I went to visited over a 3-week period, and essentially would go back and take record of what species were present by looking at its tracks. And using some fancy math, I was able to create these occurrence maps, which essentially is a probability map of where these animals may be found. Dark spots indicate where there's high probability. And so this map is for gray fox. And we were able to publish this in a Journal of Mammalogy along with my advisors. So this is another example of using tracking in research. So tracking is definitely used in science, but there's a strong argument to be made that actually tracking might have been the origin of science. We know that the hunter-gatherer communities have developed very sophisticated evidence-based understanding of wildlife and their behavior and the ecology. And that process is very similar to what the scientific process is. It involves making observations, involves asking good questions, making hypotheses, And then if you're following animals out in the field, and sometimes you lose track, you kind of have to test these hypotheses. If you know the animal very well, you can kind of predict where it's going to go, even if you can't find its sign. So the art, it's also an art to some degree, especially when it comes to asking right questions. This is a question, this is a picture of Toro Park, the backside of Toro Park. And as I was just getting to know this place, I was spending quite a bit of time out there. And so there's this trail that's a human trail, but then I noticed all these sort of parallel lines going up and down the slope. And so I was quite curious, what exactly am I looking at? Is this something natural? That didn't seem right. If this was some sort of geologic process, things tend to happen parallel to the slope, not perpendicularly. So was this made by human? That didn't seem like a likely candidate either. So who was it? What kind of animal might have made it? And how was it made? And where were these signs? So I noticed that these lines were not present all over Toro Park. It was only in that backside of the park. And when were these made? Maybe you can take a look at some ortho imagery from back when and figure out how all these tracks were. And why is this happening? And so all these questions were kind of twirling in my mind. And then I realized that this is the part of the Toro Park where there's active grazing happening. And so these are trails that are made by cows that are just brought there every springtime. And as they feed, they kind of tend to scatter all across the landscape. But when they travel, they do the same thing as we do. We don't like to go up and down the slope. They follow a nice parallel line. And I've observed them do this, where one cow will follow and lead, and a bunch of them will follow, and they'll create all these sort of terrace-like features on the slope. So that was cool to figure out. But you can track on a landscape level, but oftentimes people think of tracking as looking at footprints, and it's definitely that as well. It involves some understanding of basic foot morphology. So there's some fancy words there, digitigrade or plantigrade. Plantigrade essentially means that animal supporting itself with all the bones of its foot. So we are plantigrade animals. We strike the ground with our heel and we lift off with our toes. But some animals only land on the ground with their toes and their carpal pads. And some animals, like deer, for example, only touch the ground with their toes. And so it's important to know things like that. It's important to notice how many toes, palm pads are present. In this case, we have 4 toes and 1 fused palm pad here. And if there's presence of claws, that's a good clue. And then just recognizing shapes like oval or round shapes. Those are all useful skills. And then taking size of a track can be very useful if you're trying to determine a species of a family particularly. So those are all the things that trackers have to know and pay attention to. So the picture on the left is a front foot of a gray fox, and the one on the right is a front foot of a bobcat. And there are 4 visible toes actually on both felines and canines. They do have that 5th toe that's really reduced. You can't even see it over here, but if you have a dog or a cat at home, you probably play with them, and there's a carpal pad over here. But these features generally don't register unless it's a very deep substrate. So 4 toes, 1 palm pad. Are there claws? Well, there are claws present on a fox foot, but cats have protractable claws. So when their foot is relaxed, you don't get those claws in the track. What is the shape? Sort of oval shape for the fox and more round for a cat. What's the relative size of the toes and the palm pad to the entire track as compared to one in a cat here, much larger for the cats. And then notice that negative space, so the space between the toes and the palm pad. Look at this big furry open space there versus relatively small space in the bobcat. So when you translate to seeing tracks, you look for the same features. These are the toe marks. That's the palm pad right there. Note the overall circular round shape of the track. there's a slight asymmetry, so that toe is a little bit lower than the toe number 3. So kind of like our own hand. If you take your hand and you notice that a little bit of a curvature to the side, that's exactly what we're seeing right there. 4 teardrop-shaped toes on each foot, and large palm pad. Notice how large this palm pad is compared to the entire track. It takes probably at least a third of this whole track. And then distinct triple lobe on the posterior end of the palm pad. There's actually a double lobe here, but sometimes it doesn't register very clearly. And then this is very useful. If you can make kind of a C shape between the toes and the palm pad, that's a good indication that you're dealing with feline tracks. And also a good clue is there are no claw marks, which there are none here. That's also a feline trait. And then again, you can use size for species ID. These tracks were roughly the size of my palm, so we're not dealing here with a house cat or a bobcat. These are mountain lion tracks. Compare those to those of canine tracks, wild canine. Again, toe marks and the palm pad right there. Oval shape as compared to the round one of the cats. There is that symmetry, so one side of the track is very similar to the other. 4 toes present in each foot. Toes tend to leave the deeper impression, especially in the hind feet. Look how fairly faint this palm pad impression is, so they're kind of toe heavy. And small pad relative to the entire track. And then if you can make an X shape between the toes and the palm pad without crossing either one of those, that's a good indication of a canine track. And we have those claw marks. So these are kind of like your field marks in a field journal. If you're looking at birds, you have these specific field marks. Same idea here. And then again, we can use scale for species ID. These are roughly 2 inches, slightly more, so that's within the range of our coyote. And note here that domestic dogs come in all shapes and sizes, so there are dogs that can look a lot like coyote tracks or fox tracks, but most of the time they don't. They're kind of flat-footed and their toes splay out and their claws are really thick. So generally you can tell those apart quite easily. So, quiz time. Are these tracks, one of these tracks is a bobcat track, one of these is a gray fox track. So tell someone next to you right now which one is which. Sorry. What do you think?
Coyotes on the right.
Fox on the right and the bobcat on the left. All right, a lot of stimulating discussion happening. So let's go over what we see. Do you guys notice kind of general round shape for this? Notice how large this palm pad is compared to these tiny little tracks. I didn't tell you this, but these are 2 tracks, right? Hind foot on top of the front, so that's a little harder to see. But the palm pad's so much smaller than the one here. There are clear claw marks here. Maybe there's a little bit over here, but you can't really see them very clearly. And so these are same scale, but one is a bobcat, the other one is gray fox. If you think the bobcat's on the left, raise your hand. If you think the gray fox is on the right, raise your hand. Okay, you guys are all right. Awesome. So you're all trackers now. So let's talk about some other species you may run into or their sign while you're tracking out here. So we'll cover species that have 5 toes on each foot, starting with our raccoon. Look at those long sausage-like fingers. One thing about raccoon tracks is that you'll often see this pattern of the front foot right next to a hind foot, and this pattern alternates. So next one up would be a front foot on the right and a hind foot on the left, and then back and forth. So that's the way they walk. Yeah, it kind of takes a little mental gymnastics to get your head around it, but yeah, essentially they move their move one side of the body at a time. So wherever the front left foot was, that's where the right hind foot would land right next to. Then for skunks, kind of notice this blocky appearance for the skunks. Notice these long claw marks on the front foot. And then also in the hind foot, there's a palm pad here, but there's another really clear pad in the back there. And then notice this pattern. This is a front foot, and then this is hind foot, but these 2 feet are right next to each other. You'll often see this pattern. They predominantly just use this. It's called a lope. So even if you don't find all these fine details, but you'll just see the impression of this pattern of 1, 2, 1 tracks within the size of a skunk, you're likely dealing with a skunk. And then check out these fun opossum tracks. What's really neat about them is the opossums have this opposable thumb on their back foot. That's this thumb sticking out like a sore thumb on the right. And then look at the front foot as all these star-like shape of tracks, like fingers sticking out all the way around. Sometimes this hind foot will land right on top of the front, and it just looks like a jumble of toes. That's a clear sign of opossum track. And these, I just got these recently from Salinas River. These are weasel, long-tailed weasel, very small tracks, kind of star-shaped pattern, and kind of 3 lobes within the palm pad here. Of course, we also have bears. I don't have a picture here, but size is a good sign for bears. And then we have a bunch of rodent species with 4 toes on front and 5 toes on hind feet. With the common ones around here, ground squirrels. Notice how these are the front feet here and the hind feet there. With a lot of fossorial animals that do a lot of digging, they kind of have this curvature to their front feet. And these are fun. Kangaroo rats generally travel in what's called bipedal hops, so you only see their hind feet hopping. But in this case, I was able to find a spot where it actually put its front feet down, so that was really neat. And then these are beaver tracks by Salinas River. How many of you guys knew that we had beaver in Salinas River? When I first saw these, I couldn't quite believe it myself, but tracks don't lie. These are large feet of the beaver, and these are the smaller feet there. And then there's obviously many other rodent species that we don't have time to go over. And then we can't leave out the birds, right? So there's 5 different categories of bird tracks. We have what's called the classic bird tracks. So with the toe number 1 or the hallux pointing backwards, and then toe 2, 3, and 4 pointing forward. These are raven tracks. And then we have game bird tracks. So the 3 toes register, but the hallux only has like a small little dot in the back. These are wild turkey tracks, and quail would fall into the category, as well as some of the shorebirds. Then we have zygodactyl tracks for things, owls or roadrunners. So this is toe 1 in the back, facing back. That's toe 2, 3, and then that 4th toe can point to the side or maybe all the way backwards sometimes. And then we have, oh, by the way, yeah, so look at this size of these tracks. These are big owl tracks walking down the beach. And then we have webbed feet, things like gulls and terns. And then we have tody palmate tracks. So this is not the best example because you can't see the webbing. But if you walk back after the presentation and look at those pelicans back there, you'll notice the webbing all between all 4 toes. So 5 different types of bird tracks. Obviously, animals leave all the other signs, a bunch of other signs aside from tracks. Things like scat or droppings, fur, feathers, or scratch marks like this bear scratch sign on the tree. Burrows, nests, feeding signs like chewed vegetation or bones. And then you get a lot of clues from the habitat and surrounding vegetation and seasonality as well. When people think about tracking, they often think about following animal to the actual animal, and that's definitely an art in itself. To do that safely, you kind of have to really know certain things about strategies for safe, ethical trailing. You don't want to necessarily make the animal nervous. You don't want to make it uncomfortable. But it does involve quite deep knowledge of animal gaits, so how animals are moving. And you kind of have to anticipate the animal behavior to predict movement. If you start with a set of tracks that are, let's say, are 2 hours, that were made 2 hours ago, trained trackers have to really know how to navigate the terrain to be able to create shortcuts so they can actually catch up to the animal. And that involves a lot of awareness and sensory skills, so heightened use of sight, not only for seeing the animal itself, but maybe seeing other signs like, let's say, a towhee flying from the ground up to the branch because it was disturbed by something, or listening to alarm sounds of a junco. Smell and touch can also be very useful when you're crawling through some thickets. You have to be able to read the landscape holistically, so looking how the terrain, vegetation, and water sources are interplay and how the animal may navigate those things. And then aging tracks is also important, so not only knowing what the weather pattern was over, like, say, last 12 to 24 hours, but also how the weather may affect the tracks and how they deteriorate over the time. And then just developing situational awareness in the field. You really have to be aware of your surroundings when you do this. Really trained and good trackers kind of describe it as a total immersive experience in the environment. It's kind of like a mindfulness exercise in a way. So what are benefits of tracking? Rekindling of childlike wonder. If you come to the tracking club, you often see people do silly things like this. When this is a friend of mine trying to recreate the pattern that she sees of this deer that walked over here, and trying to figure out and learn those gaits can be a fun exercise, so you can actually track with your whole body. It does increase your awareness of your surroundings. And it's a close community. It's a small community, but growing community of really fun nature geeks. So people who are really stoked on nature, you would fit right in. And you're preserving an ancient art form. So this is not only something that has been passed on thousands of years, but hundreds of thousands of years. And those are skills that take patience and practice to develop. So if you're into lifelong learning, there's always something new to learn. The quote here is from a Bushman tracker from The Great Dance, the movie, a documentary movie. And he said, tracking is like dancing because your body is happy. And if you were to see this film, you see that they're always smiling and happy, even though they live in very difficult conditions. How to start tracking? So you do have to put in the dirt time. There's no way around it. And doing it solo is great. Doing it with other people is great also, because often other people will notice things that you don't. So Tracking Club is a great place for that. There are classes and workshops. And where do you go tracking? I was getting ready to go to work one morning. I stepped outside, and as I was about to get into my truck, I noticed these droplets. And they kind of seemed a little odd, so I paid a little closer attention and realized that there was just enough of condensation that when the cat walked around, there's one droplet for each toe and a palm pad. So that was neat to see. So you can go tracking anywhere, really. But if you're just starting out, you kind of want to set yourself up for success. So pick locations with good substrate, the beach, riverbanks, dirt roads. Ideally, you have places that are easily accessible, that have reliable wildlife presence, but low human traffic. And then you have to do your homework. Start with a species list. So who are your neighbors? Literally get to know who are the animals that live in our area. And iNaturalist is a great resource for that. And then also, if you can recreate the story of the day from your experience, that's a great practice. Either tell it to someone if they're willing to listen to you, or if not, write it in your journal. Or you can post it to iNaturalist, which has a good tracker community, and there are Facebook groups as well dedicated for this purpose if you're into that kind of thing. And then there are many resources. I just listed a few here. How about natural history museums? There's so many things here that teach on display. This is a great spot. There are many field guides. Ones by Mark Elbrock are excellent. There is also an iTrack Wildlife app. And there are Tracker Tuesdays, which are put on by the Tracker certification, the CyberTracker program in North America. So those are great because they have a lot of advanced trackers just talk about their experiences out in the field. There's the Bay Area Tracking Club, which I have mentioned, meets every second Sunday of the month. We usually meet north of Santa Cruz. The Gazos Creek State Beaches are kind of home base, but sometimes we host it here as well in our area here. And there are many tracking schools and classes, too many to list here. iNaturalist has a great project called North American Animal Track Database. So if you use iNaturalist, you can submit your observations to the projects. If you submit to this one, people will often help you identify things. And the iNaturalist app, the AI app, is quite good as well. There are many films and videos. I mentioned The Great Dance. That's a great film. Just be aware, it is a hunter story, so there are animals being hunted in it. If you're sensitive to the kind of thing, just be aware. And there are Facebook groups. One is called Animals Don't Cover Their Tracks. And then lots of blogs and podcasts. The one I like is Track and Seek, because that's the one I write. So you can scan this QR code, and I have this resource page out on there if you're curious about any of these to pursue further. So to conclude, tracking involves recognizing patterns, piecing them together, and storytelling. Tracking skills enrich one's relationship with nature, and there are also important tools for research and conservation. And the 6 questions of tracking: what, who, how, where, when, and why. If you know how to ask these properly, that will help you along the tracking journey. We talked about foot morphology and the difference between feline and canine tracks. We talked a little bit about trailing and what are the benefits of tracking, and then how to get started. And so I'll finish with the quote from Mark Elbrock, who was responsible for bringing the CyberTracker evaluation process to North America. He also wrote several excellent field guides on tracking, and he said, "The competent tracker is both scientist and storyteller. You must critically observe, collect good data, and avoid rushed conclusions, as well as use your imagination to interpret and celebrate the signs you have discovered." And so with that, I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah.
Do you journal your tracking record, and follow up to that is like by words, do you illustrate? I could see how this could be such an asset to a nature journal.
It is. Drawing tracks is really useful. Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be a skill, but it is something very useful, especially if you're starting out. And so, yeah, when I was starting out, I would do quite a bit of journaling and drawing. And it's not only the track itself that you can draw. You can draw the surrounding landscape, so kind of get yourself placed from the point of view of an animal. And then you can journal the tracks that you think it may be, what kind of animal it may be, what are the 5 similar animals, what it could be. So there's a whole process, journaling process they can go through that will help you with that. These days, I just take pictures, but I try to be cognizant of it when I come home and organize them in a certain way. And then if I have time, I'll review them. Yeah. So what is that? It's something that I found on the beach that looks like has a lot of legs that started from one end came out of the sand, and then looks like it might have burrowed itself in the sand right here. So what could it be? So it's a sand crab, yeah.
Do you have a favorite book that you recommend if people are maybe into the digital components, like a classic textbook or field guide?
Yeah, so the field guides by Mark Elbrock are excellent. So he has a couple. There's a smaller version that is a field guide that you can take with you. There's a bigger version that's also called a field guide, but it's quite heavy, so I don't take that one out in the field very often. But yeah, there are a lot of field guides now that are available that weren't when I was starting out. and there are a lot of good ones. So if there are specific ones that you're looking to get, I'm happy to talk to you more afterwards. Yeah. Yeah.
Are there any cards, that you carry with you, a little handy guide with?
Yeah, so there's several of those. Mark Elbrook, I think, put up one of those kind of laminated field guides. They're useful to a point. After a while, if you really get into it, you should get a field guide. Yeah. And then you can also, I just observed somebody else do it. You can download the field guide on your Kindle so people have access to it on their phone so they don't have to log their book with them all the time. But the wildlife app is quite good as well. Yeah.
How about scat? You didn't mention scat.
Yeah, I figured people might get a little squirmish if I talk about scat. But scats can be tricky. I got tricked myself the other day when I was checking some cameras and I found a scat right in front of me. Like, oh, that looks like a bobcat scat. And I reviewed the imagery and actually it turned out to be a coyote. So they're much more, there's a lot more ambiguity there. But there are certain things that you can look for. For example, cats are strictly carnivorous. So if you're into that kind of thing and you break it apart and look what's inside, if all you find is fur and bones, then that's more likely that it came from a cat versus if there's things like seeds or even some vegetation and some fur, then it's mostly an omnivore. And then obviously things like rabbits and deer will just have vegetative matter in them. So yes, you can tell quite a bit from looking at scat. These days, a lot of researchers will collect it and run it through a scanner, DNA scanner, but it can be useful as well. Yeah, and it can be useful knowing what the animals are feeding on too.
Like owls.
Like owls, for example, with those are not their scats, they're pellets, they cough it up. But with things like bear, for example, tracking bear, knowing what they're eating, then helps you navigate if you're trying to find their sign out in the landscape, and let's say they're feeding on berries. Well, where are the berries on the landscape? That kind of helps you clue in on some locations. Yeah. Question?
How common would it be when you're tracking in the field to come face to rear end with an animal you're tracking?
My rear end or the animal's rear end?
Well, be your rear end if it's a bear.
Yeah, so that's the part of trailing. That's a very sort of advanced skill. I'm not quite there yet. I'm hoping to get there someday. But for me, it happened maybe on a couple occasions, but not that often. It depends where you are, too. On a place like Gazos Creek State Beach, there's only so much of the beach before you run into thickets or you run into private property. So you have to be able to go somewhere where there's extensive open space that you're able to follow an animal for quite a while. Yeah. Yeah.
I thought of one more thing. So yeah, scat and footprints, and then the scratches. Can you tell when something is eating something? Like you knew it was the deer mice eating the sea rocket because of their footprints, but can you tell from incisors or some vegetation's been browsed?
Yeah. Yeah. So there are definitely clues that you can look for on vegetation itself. Oftentimes you'll see things that are cut at a 45-degree angle, and those are generally from rodents or rabbits. Versus if a deer browses something, they actually don't have teeth up on the front part of their jaws, so they're kind of just crush things and they pull things. So their vegetation that's been eaten by deer looks a lot different, or that browse sign looks a lot different than something that was like a rabbit. And then you can kind of clue also at what height are you seeing the browse. If you're seeing it right over here, that's not going to be a rabbit. If you're seeing it over here, maybe that's a jackrabbit. Or if it's lower, then maybe it's some sort of rodent like a wood rat. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of sign that you can read from the vegetation itself, as well as things like broken branches, just animal trails that are made recently in the vegetation. Yeah.
How do you age the track? I mean, you can obviously, if it's wet in the morning, but how do you do it if it's not like that? Or can you do that?
Well, yes, you can. It takes a lot of just practice. One exercise you can do at home is set up a little tracking box with some sand and put in bunch of markings with a stick and go back there an hour, 2, 3, 5 hours later and see how things change over time. And essentially, as time progresses, you'll see less fine definition. When the tracks are fresh, oftentimes they're very crisp edges. And as the track weathers, those edges kind of become weathered and rounded. The tracks fill out with sand to the point where they're just tiny little indentation. Eventually, they disappear. So it will depend a lot on what's happening with the weather. If it's a windy day, you may see tracks disappear right in front of you. Yeah. Yeah, question about. All the time. I get stumped all the time. I got stumped with this. But yeah, I think recent stumping occurred at also Gazas Creek State Beach. And it was a mole. And moles generally tunnel right underneath the surface. So you see like a broken kind of a line that's broken that's top of the surface of the ground. But this mole ventured out on top of the beach and just kind of seemed to book it right for the waves. And I'm not sure if it was collecting something that had washed ashore with the tide, but it was wild to see that out in the middle of the beach. But at first I thought it was some sort of amphibian, and then it didn't quite make sense for an amphibian to go towards salt water. So I had to scratch my hand over that a little bit. Yeah.
One more question I thought of. Do you do this in like your job? It's part of your work to have this skill?
I wish this was like majority of my work. Maybe it's like 1% of my work now. So yeah, I work on the photo cleanup project, and we do have cameras for watching for trespassers. So every time we check cameras, so I'll look around on the ground, see what's out there, but not extensively. Sometimes I pay attention to these things when we go review our restoration sites. So we're putting out plants and something's been eating them. I look for that 45-degree cut and kind of pay attention how high it is. Not that we would act on it necessarily. We wouldn't cage all the plants that we put out, but just kind of need to know, okay, so many Arctostaphylos montriensis got snipped by the jackrabbit, Yeah. Well, if there's no other questions, thank you very much again for having me. And if you have any questions afterwards, I'm happy to hang out and answer it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Should I'm not sure if you're the right person to ask, should I just delete those from the desktop?
Sure.
The files?
Yeah, if you'd like, if you want to delete it, that's fine. I'm sure that's fine.
Interesting. Mix it up a little bit and have other things besides birds.
Well, you can bird tracks, or you can